Hello, everyone. I'm Marilyn Turkovich, the Executive Director of the Charter for Compassion, and welcome to our September Global Read. This is something that we do each month, and if you come to our website, you'll see what the schedule looks like, what our next books are going to be, and we are already getting our lineup for 2022, so we're pretty excited about that. Today, with our September Global Read, we have David Sloan Wilson. And David is bringing us into a whole new realm of the Global Read. We have two books today, not one. The first one, This View of Life, which is Completing the Darwinian Revolution, and the second book, Atlas Hugged. And for many of us who remember Atlas Shrugged, this is a whole new flip of the coin for us to experience. The host for today is Michael Carlin, who is really known to the Charter. He's co-creator of the Compassion Integrity Training Program that we rely on, and we hope that every compassionate individual who's a part of the Charter and beyond that will take advantage of. And just before we get started, I want to share with you our October Global Read, and that is with David Korten. And David has been a true mentor to the Charter for Compassion. He is a person who wrote an interesting short book just a few years ago called Change the Story, Change the Future. And David, just like David Sloan Wilson, is making his book, Ecological Civilization, available as a PDF free. So you can get the link to that book right on the Charter website. So before I take any more time, I'd like to turn this over to Michael, who will make all of the introductions. Thank you, and I'll be back with you soon.
Thank you, Marilyn. Wonderful introductions, and I just love that you mentioned the book Change the Story, Change the Future, because I think that is so much of a theme of what we're going to be covering today. I believe we're going to get started with David giving some opening remarks just to set us up for conversation, and then we'll spend probably the first 30 to 40 minutes engaged in conversation ourselves, and then we will conclude hopefully with lots of interaction and comments and questions from folks who are watching. So we'll be paying attention to the chat and to the Q&A to make sure that we capture everyone's questions. But maybe just to get us kicked off, I'll turn it over to you, David, and have you give us some opening remarks, and then we'll engage in some good conversation.
Great. Well, I'm so happy to be here, and a big admirer of David Korten, by the way. And David and I have a conversation about Atlas Hugged on the Atlas Hugged website. So our views are very close to each other. And he has very nice things to say about Atlas Hugged. But to begin with, This View of Life. So This View of Life is nonfiction. Atlas Hugged is fiction. And they're both driving in exactly the same direction, so much that I made the cover similar to each other. And to begin with This View of Life, the title is drawn from the last paragraph of Darwin's Origin of Species, where he writes, "There is grandeur in this view of life." And what he was commenting upon was the amazing explanatory scope of his theory, that you could begin with these very simple premises of just about everything varies. Those differences make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction. And those traits tend to replicate from parents to offspring. Put those together, and it made sense of everything around him, such as the fossil record, the geographical distribution of species, and of course, all those wonderful adaptations that adapt organisms to their environment. And so this idea of a theory that is such an amazing explanatory scope, that fulfilled itself with the topic of biology. During the 20th century, so that by the 1970s, a geneticist named Theodosis Dobzhansky could say, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, this amazing theory that explains basically all of life. And yet, in the 20th century, there was in fact what I've come to call the great constriction, which is that the study of evolution, unlike Darwin, of course, who knew nothing about genes and who thought about replication, heredity more broadly, and thought deeply about humans, topics such as morality, compassion, sympathy, prosociality, and culture. Unlike Darwin, the study of evolution became quite narrowly constricted on genetic evolution. And today, around the world, you say the word evolution, and most people hear the word genes, as if the only way that offspring can resemble their parents is by sharing genes. Adaptations were framed as selfishness, all forms of selfishness, even compassion as a variety of selfishness. So if I help my kin, I'm helping my genes in the bodies of kin, and if I help you, I'm helping you in expectation of getting some kind of a return benefit. And by all means, formulating evolution as if it has no conscious purpose whatsoever. Organisms simply vary, and only the immediate environment does the selecting. And so that was the field of evolution when I entered it. It's a graduate student in the 1970s. And if you compare this configuration of ideas with the ethos of the Charter for Compassion, which, and I quote, rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, you can see that there's almost no overlap at all. This great theory of evolution has essentially nothing to say about the ethos and the aspirations of something like the Charter for Compassion. And so what's so wonderful is that during my career, and I'm proud to have played a role in it, there's been a sea change in evolutionary thinking over the past few decades. And so now evolution is studied as not just genetic evolution, but any process that combines those three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. That includes not only cultural evolution, so all the fast-paced cultural changes that are swirling around us, but also our personal evolution. Each and every one of us is an open-ended evolutionary process. It's fascinating to think about each and every one of us as an evolutionary process. Compassion, altruism, I use the word prosociality. Anything oriented towards the welfare of others and society as a whole can now be explained at face value by a Darwinian process. Goodness can evolve. It doesn't always evolve, but it can. And that should make us curious about the conditions that favor the evolution of compassion and everything that comes with it. And human cultural evolution is clearly consciously directed to a degree and needs to become even more so. And so this is like, all of a sudden, this wonderful, wonderful theory, which had nothing to say about the agenda of something like the Charter for Compassion, now has a great deal to say, And we might even say not only nothing about biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, but we might say nothing about humanity, culture, or policy. What we actually do in the world makes sense except in the light of evolution. And when that happens, then and only then will the Darwinian revolution be complete. And so that is the thesis of this view of life. Now my AirPods have stopped here for a moment. I need to just adjust them. Hold on a minute. Then I might have to switch to. Let me switch to my cable. Hold on a minute.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. How's this now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep, we're good. We're good. Michael,
Let's-
you might want, I'm not much like a fire hose here. I might pause and have you say something before I march on.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I think one of the things that is a question that I think I know the answer based on reading the books, but is that I think the switch that flipped was this kind of move from individual selection to multi-level selection. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about maybe start with a little something about Atlas Hugged first, but I have to me, one of the most game-changing kinds of ideas that you present in the book that then gets carried out in narrative form is this idea of multi-level selection. And so I don't know if you want to we can just jump into the conversation now, or if you wanted to say something prepared.
No, it actually was my next point, Michael. So I wanted to drill down on 2 points. One is multi-level selection, which explains how compassion and everything that comes with it can evolve by a Darwinian process. And the second thing is the idea that our symbolic systems, everything in our heads, our worldviews, our religions, our scientific theories, everything inside our heads can actually be thought about as literally like our genes, and that in our species, there's 2 streams of inheritance. One is the genetic stream, and the other is the symbolic stream. And to actually make that comparison and to follow through on the implications of that comparison is just amazing, and has deep implications for what we think about therapy and training and spirituality and all of these things that are so close to the ethos. So let me I'll go through both of those, make a talk a little bit about Atlas Hugged, of course, and then we can open it up. So imagine a highly compassionate individual who acts upon their compassion. And so what does that mean? It means they extend themselves to others all the time. And what's obvious, or at least should be obvious, is that although that's wonderful, I mean, that person is a wonderful person, that person is also a vulnerable person, vulnerable to exploitation by others who are not so compassionate. And the vulnerability of prosociality and compassion, it's all of its forms, I think, is something which is often understated and underappreciated. Why is that? It's because in our efforts to encourage people to be compassionate, we also often say, wouldn't the world be a great place if everyone was compassionate? You'll be happier if you're compassionate. Science shows that compassionate people feel better as individuals, so on, as if it's so simple as that, compassion is a form of wisdom or maturity or something like that, when in fact, often compassion is, unless you live in a safe social environment, then compassion is dangerous. It's dangerous. And when it's unrequited, it's toxic, psychologically toxic to be extending yourself, and for that, for example, never to be recognized, not to speak of exploited. That's that kind of thing that leads to burnout and the like. And so what this reveals in an evolutionary sense is that if you just look at evolution at the smallest scale between individuals, competition between individuals within a single social group, the advantage goes to the self-seeker. And so that part of evolution indeed weighs in favor of selfishness in all of their forms. It is a disruptive evolutionary force at that scale. So that's the bad news. But the good news is, imagine a group of people that are all compassionate towards each other, and compare that group to a group of selfish individuals who cannot cohere. And so when we look at evolution at that scale, which is between groups, then we do find an evolutionary force that weighs in favor of compassion, at least within the group. And of course, you should be thinking, what about between group interactions? And at this point, we have to extend this levels thinking to multiple levels. We can even go down, and we can think of cancer as a form of selfishness within the body. And so our body consists of compassionate cells. They're certainly cooperative um, cells. But cancers grow by definition, they proliferate at the expense of the normal cells of the bodies. And that's successful in an evolutionary sense. And so this even plays itself out within our bodies, in which we are the group, we are the social group, and ourselves and our genes can be disruptive actors. So that's just a taste, but I hope it shows how everything that we associate with goodness and morality can in fact evolve by a Darwinian process, but only when certain conditions are met. And then in a policy sense, what we do in our lives at all scale is something, I mean, there's the tremendous insight here basically for making a compassionate world. So there's just a taste on multi-level selection.
Great.
And then to say a little bit more about Michael, again, I'll pause and then I'll have one more piece before, and then a little bit about Atlas Hard, and then we have our conversation.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I do think that understanding, reframing the unit of measure, if you will, or the unit under examination, I think is so critical, both to the work that we're both doing, but also the work you're trying to communicate in the book. And I want to come back around to this because I think the symbol system that you even present a symbol system in the book, right? Both through the earth, the flag, the circle,
Yeah.
and the point, which I think really speaks to this, I think is really critical. But I think just this reframing from the individual. So even this reframing it from the individual to the group, I think shifts the way we understand it, and as you've said in the book, both books, this is grounded in science. This is not some sort of Pollyanna view of let's all get along as groups. It's more about how do we pull this out and really understand it from a different lens. And to me, that has such an impact also on the symbol system and the way we view this view of life, right? How do we view humanity, the globe, everything in it? And I think that gets carried out through the symbol system. So I want to dive into all of that stuff, but again, I want to give you time to kind of set it all up. But I think there's a very rich conversation.
Right. Well, this is the alternative to individualism. Individualism is the dominant intellectual tradition of the last 70 years, and of course has roots that extend way back. It's been an important part of the Enlightenment. And it's the idea that all things social can be reduced to the motives and actions of individuals. And Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, of course, is a ode to individualism, neoclassical economics, all of that. And what multi-level selection stands for, and throughout history, the alternative to individualism has been the idea of society as some kind of organism in its own right. And that too has long historical roots, all the way back into antiquity. The idea of society as an organism, of course, it's suffused in religious thought, the body of Christ. So that's an old idea. But what's new is that idea of society as some kind of organism is now placed, as I put it, actually both in fiction and nonfiction, for the first time in the history of ideas, on a authoritative scientific perspective. And knowing that, what that leads to is a whole earth ethic. A whole earth ethic. We must behave on behalf of the largest system, the global system. And most people listening to this in the Charter for Compassion, they already have a whole earth ethic. That's not new for them, but if you look at what underpins it, you'll find in the first place a whole rainforest of things that underpin it. That's what we mean by our meaning system. How many different ways by how many different paths can you travel can you arrive at a whole earth ethic? but what's new in this case is that we can say, in some important sense, science says this too. Science says this too, and some of the alternative narratives, especially the economic narratives, we can refute those. So this adds a kind of an authority to things that we're already thinking about. And so, just to say a little bit more about symbols as like genes, if you just imagine that, you are a collection of genes, and we call that your genotype, and those genes influence lots that could be measured about you. We call that your phenotype, anything that could be measured about you. And most species are like that. But in addition, you are a collection of interrelated symbols. Let's call that your symbotype to stress the comparison. And those symbols also influence much that could be measured about you, your very same phenotype. And those symbols interact with your genes in your lifetime and throughout our whole history as a species. Our capacity for symbolic thought evolved by genetic evolution and then has been co-evolving with it ever since. And so what that does is it stresses, and once again, this isn't new, but it adds value to it. The close relationship between the inner and the outer, basically, that if we want to change the way we act in the world, the way we currently think, your current symbotype has a degree of flexibility built into it. Based on the way you currently think, you respond to your environment in different ways. So there's some, repertoire that you have based on your current symbotype. But if you really want to change, and if you want large-scale change, then that requires interchange in order for there to be outer change. And so it provides a new sort of a window into the relationship between what's on our insides and what's on our outsides. Now, I better make it quick to get to our conversation, Michael. But
no, go ahead.
There's something about a story and fiction which is so much more compelling than nonfiction. I think that. I write nonfiction. Of course, I have to read it as a scientist. But a good story, a good yarn, a good novel, or a story of any length, movie, whatever, just grips you in a way that intellectual discord doesn't. And I think there's also an evolutionary kind of explanation of that so much of our symbolic systems are told in the form of stories. There's some sense in which we are a storytelling animal. And by the way, that's the title of a book by a former student of mine named Jonathan Gottschall, The Storytelling Animal, which is a wonderful book that I recommend to everyone. And in some ways, you could say that stories serve as vehicles for moral systems. I mean, most stories are intensely moral. What they do is they convey a sense of right and wrong, the world as it should be, even if it's not the way the world really is. And I think that's one reason, because all of our meaning systems are moral systems in a sense. They provide guides for action and guides for right and wrong. And so the reason that we're so interested in stories, passionate about some and passionately against others, if a story resonates with your worldview, you will gobble it up and you'll even forgive its faults if it's not a very good story. If a story is opposed to your worldview, you will either lose interest in it or you will actively hate it, no matter how well it is told. And so that just shows you the degree to which a story is communicating a moral world view. And so as a scientist, I've been working on this sea change in evolutionary thinking, and it provided an opportunity for me to do it also as a novelist by writing a sequel to the famous novel by Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, which is a ode to individualism. So that's what I did in Atlas Hugged. It is the main character in Atlas Hugged is the grandson of the main character of Atlas Shrugged, and I'll just read a the way the book begins. It says, "Call me anything but John Galt. That is my name, but it is also the name of my father and grandfather. I am not like them, and the world they created is not the one I desire. The tree after my name does not set me apart." And so the grandson of the main protagonist of Atlas Shrugged, basically, he rebels against the evil empire of his grandfather and father and grandmother, Ayn Rand, and actually succeeds in managing a worldwide transformation in 100 days. And I'm just going to finish up by reading the last page of Atlas Hugged, which is an epilogue titled "The Science Behind Atlas Hugged," and it's on cultural catalysis. The idea of catalysis, which is familiar in chemistry, is that the rate of a chemical reaction can be vastly increased with the addition of a catalytic agent. And so, quoting from the novel, Howard Head, who is the wise mentor of John Galt, says, "Even though the concept of catalysis is easy to understand, it is almost miraculous in what it can do. Imagine a chemical reaction taking place slowly or not at all, and then, poof, just a sprinkling of the catalytic substance is transformative. If that's not magic, what would be?" John Galt III replies, "Right," I laughed, "as magical as any spell." Howard continues, "Now let's think about catalysis in the context of cultural change." And John is thinking, poof, no one could do metaphorical transfer better than Howard. First, he rehearsed the familiar, in this case, chemical catalysis, and then he moved it over to a new context, in this case, rates of cultural change. I began to get the connections immediately, but let him continue. And now I continue as the author. So now I'm back in the real world. The possibility of cultural catalysis is fact, not fiction, even if it might not take place in 100 days. We already know that worldwide cultural change can be rapid. Look at technological innovations such as smartphones, social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, or the advent of the gig economy. The problem with these examples of rapid cultural evolution is that they were not managed with the welfare of the whole earth in mind. A single change in orientation, represented by the stack of symbols, can make all the difference in the rapid evolution of a global superorganism. I hope that my excursion into the world of fiction has given this sense of possibility to readers of Atlas Hugged. I now invite you to cross over to the world of nonfiction to make the vision of Atlas Hugged a reality. So there is a quick tour of my two books, Michael.
Thank you very much. That was great.
Over to you. Over to you.
Yeah. So there's maybe only 30 or 40 different directions we could go with this conversation. And I think I've got questions for every one of them. But I just wanted to start, first of all, let me say that I've never had the privilege of reading both nonfiction and fiction by the same author on a similar topic. And it was really, as somebody who's, as you know, a religious studies scholar and done a lot of work in storytelling and things of that nature, where we kind of posit what you had said earlier about stories being the carrier of cultural wisdom and lessons and things of that nature, morality. It was just really interesting to see that happening in real time, because I read the nonfiction first and then the fiction. So it was really great. And I'm one, like you as a scientist in some ways, I don't read a lot of fiction. So it was a real treat to do that together. So I appreciate the opportunity and the work that went into that for you. I wanted to start though by kind of looking at the way this idea of multi-level selection shows up in both books. And I think one of the things that's really, I think, important about the work is keeping the eye on the idea of multi-level, right? It's not like a individualism or the whole world, and it's just a binary, right? I think the symbol, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how you came up with this symbol and the meaning of the symbol of the earth, the flag, the circle, and the point, or the dot, because I think that speaks to the importance of understanding all four levels and appreciating all four levels, but as well as, though, keeping them in a particular order, right? A hierarchy, I think, of importance. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. So just to explain the symbology of the cover and of the true objectivist movement, the dot represents the individual. The circle represents the small group, and I'm going to emphasize the small group in just a minute. The American flag represents our existing institutions and social organizations. It could be the flag of any nation. It could be a religious symbol, the cross, Star of David. And then the earth, of course, is the whole earth. And all of those are needed. That's multi-level, not just global, not just local, certainly not just individual. And so what's needed is for individuals to form into small groups. And now I want to focus on just that piece, because it turns out the great mistake of individualism was to treat the individual person as the fundamental unit. And one thing that evolution tells us is that our species, throughout our history, individuals never lived alone. They always lived in the context of small and, for the most part, highly cooperative groups, even when those groups were warring with other groups. And what that means scientifically, this is something that's called social baseline theory, based on a wonderful colleague of mine named Jim Cohen, whose story I tell in This View of Life. And I'll relate it here quickly. I have time. What this means is that our brains and bodies evolved by genetic evolution to seamlessly integrate social resources along with personal resources. And a scientific study that Jim cites is so wonderful for demonstrating this. So imagine that I take you to the base of a hill, of a long hill, and I ask you to estimate its slope. So you do. And then I do that under some conditions in which I deplete your personal resources. You fasted or not, you're wearing a heavy backpack or not, you've had a workout or not. In each case, I deplete your personal resources. And you might think that when that happens, you're less interested in climbing that hill. But what's funny is that you actually perceive the hill as more steep. That's the way we're built. We do not see the world the way it really is. Even at that level, if we deplete your resources, you actually see the hill as steeper. And so against that background, we had a fourth condition, you versus you standing next to a friend. And just add the friend, and that hill becomes less steep. You say, let's climb that hill. And so what that means is it's your brain, without ever knowing it, this is totally subconscious, has treated a social resource in the form of your friend no differently than your personal resources, always integrating the two. And that was possible because we always lived in the context of, with the availability of social resources. So against the background of all of that, truly isolating the individual, either in reality or subjectively, so that the individual no longer feels that, or is, or feels that they're in a cooperative group. The brain and body interprets that as an emergency situation, And so the most helpful thing you can do is to get individuals operating in the context of small cooperative groups, but those groups have to be appropriately structured. And why is that? It's because if they're not, then everything that we've just said about compassion and its vulnerability comes into play. If you're in any kind of group, small or large, and it's not structured to protect you, to provide a safe social environment, then that's not going to work. But small groups appropriately structured, now you've got something. And you've got something which is not only is it wonderful for the individual, but the group is going to be more efficacious in larger scale interactions than any individual could be on their own. So the small group is like a cell. And in large society, it's the cell of a multicellular organism. In order to get the anatomy and the physiology and the nervous system, the counterparts of that, That's where you need something like where the American flag is in that stack of symbols. We can't just automatically behave on behalf of the whole earth. There's all this intermediate stuff in between that we can look about as the anatomy and physiology of a global superorganism. So that's why there has to be something. In fact, there has to be a lot in between the small group and the whole earth, and all of that is represented by the American flag in the stack of symbols.
So let's maybe talk a little bit about the small group. In the book, it shows up. You see the group of journalists, led, of course, by Bill Noyers. You have the the groups that form along the trek. Then you have all that goes into kind of organizing the group of groups, right? So you kind of lay out in narrative form what you're talking about here in kind of evolutionary form. And by the way, it is one of those things when you look back on it with an evolutionary frame, you think, how could the individual ever have been thought of as the primary unit when you look at the way we evolved as a species? It's almost like it's elementary, you know?
But what were we thinking?
Exactly. So it does make so much sense, and it's now got that.
Oh, Michael, I just have to say, just to intrude here, I gave the end of Atlas Hugged, but let me just quote the end of
yeah, please.
Issue of Life. I look forward to the day when the whole world will be saying, along with Thomas Huxley, how stupid of us not to have thought of that. And so there's this kind of obviousness in retrospect. It's just like, well, I mean,
well, and at least, in the fields of like embodied cognition now and developmental psychology, there's groups within all of those fields who are now looking at this and going like, yeah, of course, this is how we evolved. This is how it must be. But that's good news. But I guess what I was thinking about in terms of what are some, if you look at, I know you talk about Lynn Ostrom's work in This View of Life, and then you see some of those core design principles kind of showing up in the book as I was reading about the cult of scholars and reading about the journalists and then reading about, you kind of see those things kind of being implemented in a way. So maybe you can touch on a little bit about, because you talk a lot about, well, if we design it right, if the small groups are set up right. So maybe talk a little bit about some of those things that you identify in the books.
Well, point one is that cooperation is the signature adaptation of our species. Just about everything distinctive about our species is a form of cooperation. And the reason that we can be so pro-social as a species, often underpinned by feelings of compassion, is because of social control, And it sounds kind of weird because social control by itself doesn't sound very compassionate, almost the opposite. But moral systems have a compulsory dimension. First, we decide what we should do, and then we punish ourselves when we don't do that. And so, but it's precisely the compulsory component that makes it safe to be compassionate. In a strong moral system, if you operate within its framework, the framework of its norms, you can be truly other-oriented. You can be truly compassionate, and you will not be hurt by that. So the compulsory dimension of moral systems is what makes the voluntary dimension possible. That's such an interesting insight. And so when you look at groups of any kind, including small groups, what you find is that, well, first of all, if you look at hunter-gatherer groups, what you find is that this kind of vigilant form of cooperation is on full display. And there's an author named Tyson Yunkaporta, who's an Australian Aborigine. He wrote a book called Sand Talk. And he has this wonderful section in which he talks about the animal figure of the emu. And emu is basically a narcissist. And all the other animals struggle to keep emu under control. And the point of this is, and as Tyson himself says, is that the original sin of humanity is narcissism, is the idea that I'm better than you. My interests are better than your interests. And hunter-gatherer society evolved over thousands and thousands of generations to control that, to keep that under control. And if something's not right with modern life, it's because it's out of control.
Mm.
It's out of control. And so if you now look at modern groups, what you find is of all kinds, and Eleanor Ostrom is a key figure, she's showcased in This Year of Life, who studied common pool resource groups, the famous tragedy of the commons. And then I worked with her to generalize her work. And so the general form is, if you look at any kind of group, you'll find, get ready for this, a bell-shaped curve. Some will be spectacularly successful and nobody had to train them. Some will be meltdowns, and most of us in our groups are muddling along somewhere in between. And if you then, what she showed and what earned her the Nobel Prize in economics is that the successful groups implement certain core design principles. And those core design principles, when you look at them, they're basically that social control system applied in different ways. In the first place, the successful groups knew that they were a group. They had a strong sense of identity and purpose. That's the most important thing, because almost all of our groups are socially constructed. Socially constructed. And if they're not socially constructed to be clear what they are, what their purpose is, for that purpose to be meaningful, for you to know who's a member, all of that stuff, then why should we expect it to function as a group? And then in domains like decision making and coordination and so on, it's just they need to be equitable and fair. Agreed upon behaviors have to be monitored. There has to be something that you do about it. It's like a recipe for a well-regulated group that's protected, like has an immune system against selfish behaviors. And so this is part of what we use, what we can use as a coaching method for any kind of group. That's what Pro-Social World is. That's my nonprofit. And in the case of the book, there's many small groups in the book. There's the school that John goes to called the Village School, where in the novel, that's where I actually provide a lot of the information that's in back of this. But then there's the biological station, there's the church community of Eden, the Christian church community, and there's even the Redneck Society up there on Timber Ridge. That's so great, at least at that scale. And so small groups throughout the book, and I think in real life, appropriately structured always, as close to a utopia as we'll get. And I think that, you or everyone listening should be thinking back, and I hope that you've had an experience of being in a group, doing something important, often something very challenging. This is why soldiers, including my own father in World War II, regard their wartime experience as the best time of their lives, because they were doing something that was like keeping each other alive, typically in small groups. And even though it was the worst of times, as far as that feeling of euphoria is concerned, of being in a small group of people, watching each other's backs, is as close to a utopia as we can get. And so the whole challenge is, first of all, how to create that at any scale, but then how do we scale it up? Because that's what we need to do. That's what we need to turn the whole earth into. There's our challenge.
So let's, I noticed out of the corner of my eye, a question coming through from Gard about spirituality. So I want to read that question, but I also, and mention to others who are watching to please send in your questions so we can start to integrate them into the conversation. But one of the things I do want to turn to is this idea, and you and I have talked about this in the past, about the idea of religion and the kind of vertical and horizontal natures of religion. And one of the things that you talked about earlier in the conversation, which made me also think about it, was this idea of there's kind of what goes on inside our head. What is the symbol system we have inside of our head, and the opportunity for kind of, I'll call it change in subjectivity, change in the way we view the world through practice, through education, through different looking at and expanding upon different symbol systems. But then and I think we'd probably agree that a lot of movements in terms of compassion, in terms of mindfulness, all these things focus almost exclusively on that dimension, right? Changing that subjectivity and not that horizontal. So maybe give that some thought as I read Gard's question, and then we can maybe integrate that into it. He asked, why is spirituality important to the conversation about prosociality? How are the moral dimension and the spiritual dimensions linked from an evolutionary biological standpoint? And how does the thought of Teilhard de Chardin illuminate this question? That's a
Yeah,
lot.
so I know it's a lot. I don't know, Gard. So thank you,
Yeah.
Gard, for I'm happy to have you here. You know, on morality, I was talking about it. I had a conversation with a great moral philosopher named Simon Blackburn, and I began that by saying, Simon, just define morality for me as you would in an intro class before we get to what evolution might have to do with that. And he defined it as having those two dimensions. Well, with spirituality, we can do the same thing. You know, what is spirituality? How would you define it without reference to evolution? And it inherently has to do with being something larger than yourself. Take the word sacred, basically. When something is sacred, and we use that word all the time in a secular context, in addition to a religious context, it means basically it's something that's so important that you subordinate yourself to it. You respect its demands, basically, if it's sacred. If it's profane, you use it instrumentally for yourself. But if it's sacred, then you are, you worship it. Another word, worship, basically, something so important to you that all you want to do is to nurture that thing that you worship. And there's no supernaturalism required for these words. And so it turns out that when you think of us as being such a group living species, and when we're in a group that's like that, that's a state of mind of basically of feeling part of something larger than ourselves and wishing to be part of something larger than ourselves. And so it's part of the implications of multi-level selection is that that's so easy to explain as a mode of human thought and psychology. Not the only mode, but a mode that you can slip into quite easily. And when you do, of course, then individuals become so much more compliant, so much more eager to work with each other. The prospects of conflicts of interest are so much less than each individual regards themselves as a self-interested agent. And then you have this huge coordination problem of how do you align the interests of the individual with the interests of the group. And so all of a sudden, just like I said, we can explain compassion at face value, we can explain most of what we associate with a spirituality at face value. And we can see that supernatural agency is something which obviously historically has been huge in meaning systems in the past. And there's a whole conversation that we could have. I'm looking at the clock here, knowing that we can't have it all here about counterfactual beliefs, basically. Why do we believe things that have no evidential basis? And if you think of that just a little bit, you'll see that our symbolic systems, our meaning systems, because their primary purpose is to motivate action, then there's many, many contexts in which counterfactual beliefs play a positive role in that. And so the whole relationship between the practical utility of a belief and its factual basis turns into a very, very complex relationship that explains our propensity to believe fake stuff. And so there's so much to be said there. So basically, this brings in, I would say, everything associated with spirituality and religion. Religion, of course, has an organizational basis in addition to a spiritual basis. That's when you get to the vertical and horizontal
Hmm.
component. And somebody who got this very early on was Teilhard de Chardin, who was both a scientist and a Jesuit priest. And not only did he more or less create the first meaning system or moral system that was based on evolution, but he actually regarded it as a metamorphosis of the Christian religion. And so today we have figures. I mean, many people are still inspired by Teilhard, and I'm the guy that can basically update him, and through this view of life begins and ends with Teilhard.
Hmm.
So and we have other figures like Ilia Delio and her Center for Christogenesis, who is she's a Catholic sister, I think a Dominican, and very widely read, and herself is updating Teilhard, but now from a theological perspective. And what you learn from people like Ilia and scholars such as yourself is that this kind of theology, sometimes called process theology, has very deep roots. And so it's possible to think of even something like God as, in a way, that is compatible with science, as something larger than ourselves that we need to bring into being. Does not yet exist, but we need to bring it into being. And that converges upon a purely scientific account. So how interesting is that? That we could be, that we could.
Yeah. Now, I was going to say, yeah, there's a number of eminent thinkers, religious thinkers, who, particularly in the early 20th century, who start to think of God in that way and process across different religious traditions, not just within Christianity. So it's really interesting as you see that kind of convergence of science and religion occurring. One question I have, although, and I'll please, if anyone else, I think if I just look in the Q&A box and in the chat, I can find people's questions. I don't see any posted right now, so I'll go ahead and keep being the questioner. The question I have is, in that kind of horizontal dimension, you see it within, you see religious institutions who have kind of this built-in network of churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, etc., that people are coming to. Quite frankly, I think all of the data is pointing to the fact that people are becoming less and less fulfilled by those experiences and moving away from that. But how do we kind of replicate that infrastructure, if you will, if we want to create these kinds of groups that are, that using the idea of catalysis too, is how do you get this expanding on a global network basis or a global scale?
So that's the project. And as you know, Michael, from our conversation, and it was my main point I wanted to make with my conversation with His Holiness that took place a couple of years ago, now, is that so much of compassion training is on the kind of the inner transformation. And the presumption is that if you become compassionately minded, then that will lead to compassionate action. And we don't actually have to work on that part. We've done our job with the inner transformation, and that's what's not true. And you're right that you talked about the structure of any enduring religion has to have that institutional horizontal structure. My own foray into religious scholarship was to study Calvinism as it originated in the city of Geneva. And so Calvin had a catechism, that was the inner part, but he also had the ecclesiastical ordinances, which was the outer part, and the whole structure, the elders and the decision-making unit and this and that, and which was absolutely necessary. And so that is needed, but it's needed in a form that's going to be different than the traditional structures. And so that's basically our building project. And there's a bottom-up component that almost anybody can join, which is that scale of small groups, the cells. So no matter what capacity you have, you're already living in groups. And wouldn't you like to make those groups work better? I would. And so if we have a way for any group to basically learn some of these tools, and there's some flexibility tools based on mindfulness-based training, Michael, which we haven't had a chance to talk about. But the whole point of this is to get people, I mean, to engage people over the longer
Yeah,
term.
this could be a
So
series.
there's a bottom-up component that anybody can join to become organized, to have that structure at that level. And then it's possible to work at larger scales, especially with organizations like the Charter for Compassion. So there we have something which reaches many groups and many scales, cities and groups within cities. It's this point that you can then work to build that multi-level structure.
Let me make one comment and then go to the chat box for one more question. And then at that point, we may have to turn it over to Marilyn. I don't know. She'll tell us. But the comment is, I find, so as you probably know, the Dalai Lama will define spirituality in terms of secular ethics, right? So those ideas that are grounded in science, common sense, and common experience, or the metaphor he uses, it's the water that's in everyone's tea, even though there's lots of different teas, lots of different religions, there is that undercurrent. And one of the things I have found is in talking about spirituality in those ways, that people who are part of congregations around the world, it gives them almost a way of accessing their religious tradition in an even deeper way, because maybe they become, disinterested or disaffected by the tradition that they're in. And one of the things I think might be really interesting, and this is probably already what you're thinking, but would be to utilize those networks that are already existent and using these principles to kind of reinvigorate those as part of those, bring them into the fold, so to speak. So in your symbology, when you talked about the Jewish star or the sickle, and that would be a way of you already have a built-in infrastructure there, and that could be leveraged. That could make it really get that catalysis to a whole nother level. I'm sure you already thought of that.
I'll just say yes to that. Michael. Exactly.
Okay, great. And I don't mean to cut you out. I just wanted to get to this question so that we have this before we end, which is from Jesse Canner. Can we really use the same word, evolution, to describe both genetic encoding and cultural tendencies like ideas, memes, language, etc.? Isn't the real magic of genetic evolution is that certain attributes persist across generations, whereas ideas, etc., are not nearly as persistent even within one generation? So I think there's a lot of interesting things out of memetics, but that you can handle that a lot better than I can.
That, because I have just less than 1 minute, but basically, genetic evolution is typically thought of as slow, but it could be very fast. You can get genetic evolution in a single generation, and cultural evolution is typically thought of as fast, but it could be slow. There's cultural traditions that give genes a run for their money in terms of their durability and so on. And I think what's really what they both share in common, and what this view of life is basically all about, just stressing that commonality, is that whenever you get those three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication, then that leads to outcomes, basically, which can be understood with a single conceptual toolkit. That's what they share in common. And also personal evolution. The way you behave now, the way you're behaving right now, is due to some history. And that might be a personal history, a cultural history, an epigenetic history, a genetic history, but it's that history and a winnowing process that is resulted in you at this moment. And so I think that it's very important to see that commonality in mind. And yes, there are differences between those evolutionary processes. Yes, indeed.
Well, I will turn it over to Marilyn now and just say that I've thoroughly enjoyed the books, the conversation, and I have 10 pages of questions and notes, so I think I scratched the surface barely. So just the beginning, I hope. Thank you.
I need to thank both of you, and I have a feeling that maybe we need to find a way to continue the conversation. This is just, big, big thank you, because I know how much goes into putting thought into presenting, great pieces of work and synthesizing them for others. And we so appreciate it. Just a reminder that David Corton is going to be with us. I already put in the box, our chat box, that is in October. Please use the Charter newsletter because it'll keep you updated on everything that we're offering. But we also want to make certain that you are well aware of Encuentro Mundial de Valores, which is, as you can see, in its 13th year. The Charter is one of the co-sponsors of Encuentro, and it's a human values conference. It will be virtual. You will have an opportunity to listen to it in Spanish, but certainly in English as well. And it, as you can see, is for 2 full days. Please come to the Charter website or go directly to Encuentro to find out about the schedule. And I'm almost certain that the 2 individuals that you've just been listening to will be presenters at Encuentro. The other thing for which the Charter is a co-sponsor is the Parliament of World Religions. And again, that's also in October. So our October is very full. And the Charter has a track. I can't remember exactly how many workshops we have, but please join us for that. But we want you to mark your calendars for November 20th, and that is the Charter's Global Gala. This is the 4th time that we will be giving humanitarian awards, and we will have a newsletter dedicated to the gala. You should be receiving it, depending on where you are geographically, Sunday or Monday, and it will give you an overview of the gala. It is going to be spectacular. I do make that promise to you. We have incredible honorees such as Kristen Tippett and Vadana Shiva, Roshi Joan Halifax, among others. And as you can see, that there will be music as well as insightful invocations. So please consider to join us, mark it on your calendar. And thank you all for coming and being a part of the Global Read. And again, David and Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.